Hey sweet friend, in this video we're going to talk about the wet on dry technique. So in the last video you probably saw me talk about the wet on wet technique. This time we're talking about wet on dry and how I use it in my floral pieces to create more details and more depth and color for your floral pieces. So grab your paintbrushes and let's dive in. What we're going to do today is go over the wet on dry technique, and what that is unlike the wet on wet where you're adding water to your page first and then adding wet paint to it. Wet on dry is exactly how it sounds. So you're just going to add wet paint to a dry page. So what I have here, I have my Canson 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I have my Princeton round brush size 6. This is the Neptune series. Have 2 jars of water and my paints. Now with my paints already, I've sprayed some water on them because they are in half pans, so that way it gives it some time for the water to kind of soften up those colors, and that way it's easier and more pigmented when you go to paint. So that's just a quick tip. If you have these half pans or your paint is hardened like this, then make sure you spray them with water first, let them sit for a couple of minutes, and then you can start painting. So wet on dry, there's different ways people use it. So let me just show you one. First thing is called glazing, and so what I'm going to do is take one color first. So I'm going to take this, let's try this yellow here. This is called Taxi. So I'm just going to create a circle here. So this is wet paint on a dry page. Okay, so I've got a pretty transparent yellow circle, and then what I'm going to do is let that dry fully. So the key to wet on dry is you have to let your bottom layers or your top layers dry completely before you add anything on top, because what happens is if it's wet and you add something on top, it's just going to bleed, like you've learned in the previous video about wet on wet techniques. So this, you have to make sure that your paint is completely dry before you go over it. Okay, so our yellow circle is completely dry now. So now I'm going to take this blue color here. This one is called Jungle Gym, and I'm just going to go over it. So I'm going to do another circle, but I'm going to go over it. As you can see, what's interesting about this is you can still see that yellow peeking through this transparent wash of blue, and it almost looks green there. So you want to make sure that this bottom layer is completely dry, because what happens is if it's wet, these colors end up mixing and you don't get to see that yellow peek through the blue. So this technique is called glazing. So when you have dry paint and you do another wet layer on top, that is called glazing. So let me just show you really quickly how I would use this in my florals. So for example, let's do a leaf. It's going to load up with this green, which is called Recess Rebel. I'm just going to create a leaf right here. There's a stem. I'm going to point my brush and press down and lift. Press down and lift to a point. And then I have to let this completely dry. But let me actually, what I'm going to do is show you, this is one leaf here that's just that color. Let me show you over here. This will be the one that we glaze. So I'm going to do another one over here, so that way you have a comparison of the two. So I'm just going to put that down. So I have to let these two completely dry, and then I'll show you exactly what it looks like when we glaze on top. Okay, so now that our leaves have completely dried, I'm taking this is a round brush size 0 Princeton Snap brush. I'm going to take the exact same color. So this is Recess Rebel. I'm going to go in here, and I'm just going to create lines and details on top. So this is just the same color going right on top. So we're actually gonna pull this in a little bit. Just creating some lines for these leaves here. You can actually have it like that. So again, you see you can add detail to your leaves this way, but you have to make sure it's completely dry, because if not, it will bleed into there. This is what it looks like with just that green, but what if we add a wash of blue on top? So I'm just gonna do a very light, I'm gonna check my color here. Always have a scrap sheet of watercolor paper nearby to test your color. And I'm just gonna put this wash of blue over it. Very light. So this is another way you can add some contrast and fun to your floral pieces, is adding different colored leaves or adding a glaze on top. So it adds a little bit more contrast and interest to your piece. So you can see that the bottom layer doesn't get bothered. It's just going right on top of that bottom layer. You could have even done a second layer of that green. Let's say you just wanted it to be a little bit darker. You want the same hue, same color, but you want it darker. Now we're just gonna go over with the same color. And you can do this multiple times. Wet on dry is really needed for if you want to add more details. A lot of times people will use that just to add details. And so here's some examples of pieces I've done where wet on dry was necessary. So for example, these little seeds on the strawberries and the little dots here on the blueberries, these little wrinkles that you find in your carrots, those were done by wet on dry. Same thing when you're doing florals, again, adding some of these details later after they've fully dried. So with this vase, this background where it's kind of like this bright blue was done with wet on wet technique, but then to add these details of these florals on top of the vase, that was done with wet on dry. All of the veins in these petals of this bearded iris were done with wet on dry. Creating the look of this pumpkin here, this was done with 3 or 4 washes of the same color, but it was a mixture of wet on dry and wet on wet. So that's there's this one, and then here you can see it's a little bit more apparent. I started off with more of a greenish color in the background using wet on dry, let it dry completely, and then went over and glazed over with this blue, and kind of focusing more on the outsides of these little C curves and letting that inside and middle part kind of shine through. When it's lighter in the center like that, it kind of gives it that rounded look. So that's what I did to create the look of the pumpkins. Hopefully all of this was very, very helpful for you, and hopefully now you have a better understanding of when you would probably use wet on dry technique. Hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.